This video is brought to you by my patrons. Special thank you to Paul, John, ABCDEFG, Quentin and Faye. Hello chummers, I'm Benjamin, and today we will be talking about the magic system in Shadowrun 4th edition. This video will just be talking about spells from the combat magic school specifically, not other spells that can be used in combat. That will be a follow-up video. So firstly, let's touch on the three types of spells you will find in combat magic. You have touch range, single target, and area of effect. That's pretty consistent across every element, with touch range spells having the lowest drain, while area spells have the highest. Spell damage is determined by the force of the spell plus net hits. Force is declared before casting of the spell and acts as an upper limit to the spell's net hits. There is an optional rule for direct spells that has their drain increase by 1 per net hit. An optional rule I highly recommend for Game Masters to use, as otherwise direct spells are far too powerful. However, let us begin the discussion with some specifics. We will be starting today with possibly the best combat spells in the game. Knockout, Stunbolt and Stunball. These no-thrills direct mana spells are cheap, non-lethal and ignore armor. They cannot be dodged, allowing only a will plus counterspell check to resist. If you don't have a friendly mage providing counterspell support, then you are resisting with just willpower versus the mage's spellcasting plus magic and whatever foci they have with them that boost their casting. As you can imagine, this means that against most foes, these spells are virtually guaranteed success, making them cheap and reliable. The optional rule I mentioned earlier helps keep them from being so ridiculously good, but they are still the go-to non-lethal spells for most casters. These spells do not work on drones or vehicles. One final note about mana spells is that they can be used on the astral plane, meaning that having Stunbolt or Stunball will work in astral combat in place of having the actual astral combat skill. Next up are Death Touch, Mana Bolt and Mana Ball. These are the same as Knockout, Stunbolt and Stunball, except slightly more expensive and lethal. Since casters have finite spells known, I would go with the cheaper non-lethal variant due to its flexibility. If you want to go non-lethal, it's non-lethal, and if you want to go lethal, you can just finish off the enemy afterwards. Again, these spells are useless against drones, but work on the astral plane. Now this brings us to Shatter, Powerbolt, and Powerball. More direct spells, but these ones physical instead of mana based, and thus able to affect drones. These are resisted by the target's body rather than will, which makes them less effective against most combat type characters, as even without counterspell, a troll can potentially have a rather high body score, and indeed they are rather likely to do so, and that's not even considering the high body value of vehicles, making them very likely to resist. Still, these spells are effective against drones and obstacles and are more versatile than the mana equivalent, if less effective against hard targets. They still ignore armor and cannot be dodged, along with being fairly low drain for even semi-optimized characters. Which makes one wonder, why use indirect spells if direct spells are so good? Well, there are 3 reasons. Firstly, as indirect spells are not resisted directly with body, they tend to be significantly more effective against vehicles and structures, thus increasing their versatility. Secondly, you can make cold shots with indirect spells, which can significantly increase their effectiveness. Finally, many indirect spells have useful elemental effects that give them nasty capacities beyond just dealing damage. First up, we have Punch, Clout, and Blast. These raw telekinetic attacks are weaker than most indirect damage spells, having no secondary effects and dealing stun damage. They are actually reasonably low drain as indirect spells go, and as indirect spells they can be evaded with reaction, adding counterspelling if applicable, and are resisted with body plus half impact armor. This is more or less the template for indirect spells going forwards, so rather than repeating it, I am just going to discuss the pros and cons of the various elements. Acid damage. Protected against with Chem Protection armor upgrade, one of the most common armor upgrades among runners due to protecting against poison. Acid spells don't do the ongoing damage of mundane acid, but may still produce a lingering cloud of noxious smoke in the target area, creating visibility modifiers. Sadly, the lack of ongoing damage makes acid fairly weak as an offensive choice, but the clouds of toxic smoke do make it an interesting dual role element for dealing damage and battlefield control at the same time. Cold damage. Protected against with the insulation upgrade, something most armor will not have unless you're in the Arctic or otherwise in an extremely cold biome. Cold doesn't have clean-cut side effects. If your GM is lenient, then you can have it destroy firearms by freezing their lubricants and making components brittle, freezing bodies of water to create platforms or hold enemies in place, and other fun effects like that. If your GM isn't willing to indulge your creativity, then it's not worth it. This element combines well with water spells. Electrical damage. Despite the book listing electrical spells as dealing physical damage, the electrical element descriptor specifies that it is in fact stun damage. Electricity completely ignores metal armor, though it is resisted by armor with the non-conductive upgrade, which among runners is fairly common. It may deal additional damage to targets who are submerged in water, or reduced damage to targets who are not grounded at the Game Master's discretion. What makes electrical damage arguably the best option in the game is its secondary effect. If a target takes any damage at all from an electrical attack, they must make a body plus willpower check, adding half their impact armor. If they fail the difficulty 3 check, they are incapacitated for 2 plus net hits on the attack rounds, which is usually going to be the whole combat. Even if they succeed, they are at -2 dice pull on all action tests for the same period. As you can imagine, that is pretty huge, as even a small lightning attack can have serious ongoing tactical implications. Even better, while your lightning bolt deals stun damage and thus won't destroy drones, they get to make a body plus armor check or cease functioning for a similar time period, allowing you to potentially capture and reprogram them. Fun and profitable. The last element from the core book is fire damage. Physical and resisted by half impact and the fire resistance upgrade. Fire damage is very good because it sets targets on fire for ongoing damage. It can cause them to panic, of course, and it does damage until extinguished. Simple, effective, and likely to cause collateral damage. Street magic introduces a bunch of extra elements to wield. some more powerful than others. Blast attacks are hurricane-like balls of wind, dealing physical damage. There is no armor upgrade to increase your defenses against these attacks beyond the basic half impact, making blast spells reliable. They also inflict knockdown more consistently than most other elements, creating a somewhat boring but very practical offensive tool. Ice attacks are cold, with an extra effect of covering the area affected in a layer of ice that can cause people to slip or vehicles to crash. As such, this element is flat out better than cold for area attacks. Light attacks are magical lasers, once again without a direct armor upgrade to counter them. They inflict a short-term glare modifier on the target unless said target is equipped with flare compensation, a rather cheap upgrade that any runner and most elite forces will have access to. This makes these spells more effective against critters and low-end opposition like gang members, and less effective against well-equipped elite forces. Metal spells are effectively magical shotguns and fragmentation grenades. They have excellent damage, with a +2 modifier to their base damage compared to other spells, but they are poor against heavily armoured foes as they are resisted at full impact armor +2. In practice, this makes metal a poor choice of element against hard targets, though it is extremely good against soft targets. Sand spells inflict physical damage, ignore up to half impact armor, and their special effect is that they may jam up or damage machinery and vehicles not sealed against the elements. Again, this one will depend on your game master. Smoke is one of the more interesting elements for spells, as it bypasses armor and instead is treated as an inhalation vector toxin attack that deals stun damage. This means that it's useless against foes with gas masks and drones, but it is staggeringly effective against those not prepared to deal with it. Additionally, it creates heavy smoke visibility penalties for one round, making these attacks potentially devastating against those who are not ready. Sound element attacks inflict stun damage and ignore armor completely. The only defense is sound dampener cyberware or spells like silence and hush. Additionally, if the defender takes more damage boxes than their willpower from your attack, they are nauseated and deafened for 10 minutes. As you can imagine, sound is extremely powerful as a non-lethal option, but it is anything but subtle. Still, if stealth is not your focus, it is a perfectly viable alternative to stun spells. Water spells are much like blast spells, with the additional effects of potentially shorting out electrical devices and leaving the target soaking wet. Naturally, a soaking wet target is ideally suited for follow-up electrical or cold-based attacks. There is one final spell element worth mentioning, though it is not formally an element. The Fire, Water, and Napalm spells are unusually expensive for their roles as single-target and multi-target spells respectively, but combine two elemental effects into one attack, fire and water. As you can imagine, adding the ongoing damage from fire to the knockdown potential of water results in one of the nastiest combat spells around, though it does have some surprise defenses, as it is defeated by chemical protection as well as fire protection. Worth mentioning is that some spells have cheaper single target variants. These can be specific to types of object, specific species, or metatypes, or even only affect magical barriers. While some of these are tactically interesting, such as the ability to destroy all guns in the area without collateral damage, as a rule, these tend to be too specific to be practical for a starting caster. Finally, there are the elemental grenade spells. If you ever thought, I wish my firebolt was less accurate, shorter ranged, and on a delay, then these are the spells for you. While there is some tactical use in being able to cast multiple spells and then have them all detonate simultaneously, this spell option should be avoided, as it just does not measure up to the classics. Anyway, that's all for this week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. Stay safe and have fun.